Soul Assassin says, SJW's won this battle, but the war's far from over. Exactly. It's never just been about Captain Marvel, and I know that all of us here on YouTube have been obsessing over Captain Marvel and making nonstop Captain Marvel videos, and I know that there's people out there that are kind of tired of it and say, just, move on, let it go. And I understand that to a point, because the main thing that I want to get across is that Captain Marvel was a big moment. Captain Marvel, to me, was indeed, and I said this very early on, and I said this in the last video that I made before the movie actually came out, saying it is a cultural moment. It is, to me, a line in the sand moment. Will you stand on the side of those who are trying to push for this social agenda? And not just that, but push it into films and narrative and try and say, look, we can make it successful and we can market it and we can just shove it into any project and any property or any reboot maybe in the future. And I said to myself, no, I'm not going to allow that to happen. I'm not going to support that. And then you also have the fact that it is still a film that's making money. There's a lot of reasons as to why this film is making money. But there is also still a lot of other factors going on behind the scenes that I still think need to be talked about and cannot be ignored. But also at the same time, it's more than just Captain Marvel. There are plenty of films still going to happen over the next year or two. There are still plenty of things that we'll be able to talk about. Still plenty of things we'll be able to point out. And also, the box office life for this movie is not done. We still have an entire week's worth of drop-offs to figure out exactly how much this movie is going to make. In fact, the projections right now, the early projections right now for Captain Marvel for this coming weekend is $70 million, which would put it in line for about a 54% drop. Now, I think that's pretty high, meaning that I think that the estimate is pretty high, because when you have an opening like that, when you're making over $400 million because you're opening in every single screen in every single market, and on top of that, your per screen money, like the money that you're making per screen is not very good compared to a bunch of other Marvel films. I just don't see it. I don't see it having the legs that it needs to continue to make money. I really don't. It'll be interesting. Evo says, do you think the MCU will go full woke if Captain Marvel is seen as successful? Well, as I said before, it is successful. It has already made money. It is profitable at this point. It was profitable once it hit $400 million, and it's definitely something that cannot be ignored. Now, do I think that the MCU will continue to go woke and bring more woke characters? Yes and no. I think Endgame is going to be a solid MCU film. I don't think they're going to bring identity politics into Endgame, other than anything that Brie Larson might bring into it as far as the marketing for the film overall. I think that you might see something there. But as I said, that would be from her end. That would be from Brie Larson's end, and not necessarily from the Russo brothers or even from the higher-ups, because they understand that while Captain Marvel might be important to them, might be important to the cultural goal that they have, the things that they want to do, at the end of the day, they also want to make as much money as possible. So they front-loaded and front-ended Captain Marvel because they knew that if they didn't, then it probably wouldn't have made nearly as much money as it ended up making, because now they have the narrative saying, look at all the money it's made. It's obviously worth seeing. Now, whether or not that matches up, we don't know. Basically, there's two narratives that could happen as of this weekend. Either one, Disney gambled and gambled correctly by pushing a film with a specific narrative, front-loading it so that it made a buku amount of money purposefully, because you put it in all the screens possible, in the 3Ds and the IMAXs, you put it in every single country available, and it's going to be, again, the number is going to be gigantic no matter what, just because of the mass amount of theaters that are available to that movie. So either one, that's going to signal to a lot of people who are on the fence that, oh, people want to go see it, maybe I should go see it too. And then give the movie the legs it needs to keep on making money. And at that point, if that happens, if that first narrative happens, the movie's going to make well over $1 billion. I'm just saying, based on the numbers, based on the estimates, $1 billion is very much easy if that first narrative holds out. There's a second narrative, and this is the one that I'm personally attached to. And the second narrative is this, that they front-loaded this movie because they knew they had to make as much money as possible opening weekend, because remember, the studio will get around 90% in the American market from the box office. They'll get a 20, 40, 60, 70%, depending on the country, from the foreign market. And so when we look to that, we understand that they are going to do the very best that they can to make as much money as possible, because they know once week 2, once week 3, etc., go and happen, the money's going to stop coming in. The money's going to fall out pretty quickly, and they're going to want to have made as much money as they possibly could have in the very beginning. So again, I go along with that the second narrative, that it's going to have a massive drop off, and then it's going to peter out, and it's going to peter out to the point where it's going to make the amount of money that, I and some others had originally predicted of it making money, but not being the gigantic 800 million, not making more than Wonder Woman, for example. However, we won't know that until the numbers come in for this weekend. But just based alone on the drops we're already seeing in China, the drop from Sunday to Monday domestically, the 70% drop from Sunday to Monday, it doesn't seem to look good at this point. But of course, we don't know. We will not know until those numbers actually come in. And basically, I think that they'll continue to try and push certain aspects of the woke narrative, and they will make independent, local, or woke films in general. But they also want to make sure they make money. And Endgame is going to be a film where I think they honestly are going to think, hey, we can make, $2+ billion with this movie if we market it right, if we make it right. And they're also setting up for Phase 4. This is the end of Phase 3, and they're not going to want to, if they end Phase 3 with a woke narrative that sets up a future of woke narratives, that is going to be a very bad decision on their part. And people can try and spin it all they want and say, oh, but Captain Marvel proves that's not right. The problem with that is that Captain Marvel was guaranteed to succeed. I did this in the live stream last night, and I cut it for the video for today because I knew that I would have the parent-teacher conferences, is that they knew that they could have this number. They knew that they were going to make money. They knew that they were going to break records. And the reason why is because they essentially orchestrated it as such. They packed it in as many theaters as possible with as much money from tickets as possible with the 3D and the IMAX, and also in all the countries that were possible. And in the end, you ended up getting this gigantic number. But the drop-off is going to be what's going to be most interesting to see. Super says, I wanted to ask you, yesterday you said CM was the 9th best opener. Do you know which had the worst opening? By opener, so yesterday what I said, and I just want to be specific here, is that out of the top 9 movies that had the most money per screen, Captain Marvel was 9th. So what I mean by that is you have 9 movies that are also, again, very, very successful. They are also like the 9 highest grossing openings of all time. However, what I was talking about specifically was how much money each movie made per theater that it was in. And what I pointed out was that Captain Marvel made about $35,000 per theater. But when you compare that to Black Panther, which was available in less theaters, making $50,000 per theater, and therefore making $200 million on opening weekend instead of the $153 that Captain Marvel made, it shows that there's obviously not the same amount of enthusiasm for Captain Marvel. I think that that's where you see the boycott have an impact, because the generic MCU fans were showing up no matter what. But looking at the per theater count, and also looking at the fact that you have $150 million domestically and $300 million in the foreign market on opening weekend, that kind of split is unheard of. Like, that kind of split is the largest split of any opening of any MCU film. And it's because they put all of their money and all of their eggs into that foreign market. The problem with that bet is that if you put all of your money there and you expect to make a giant profit off of it, at least for your opening weekend, you leave yourself susceptible, if the movie is not good or if it's not well received, for that same foreign market that just boosted you up opening weekend to say, all right, we're done, and then see the massive drop off, the massive slide off. And because you don't have the staggered release, which is what most big budget films, most MCU films have, it leads to a film not having the legs to keep on making money, to stay in the discussion, and then eventually peter out. So as I said, 2 narratives here. Captain Marvel is either going to be a $1 billion film or it's going to be a sub-$1 billion film, still making a lot of money, but falling more into the $600 to $800 million range. And to me, that $200 million can definitely be attributed to the backlash. And again, people can try and argue against it all they want, but when you look at the numbers and the metrics, there's definitely a number there that is affecting this film. That's a good question, though, Super. Dalton Mortimer says, I'd honestly be surprised if Captain Marvel passes 600 million. Just, again, even if the second scenario, which I'm believing in, is true, it's still very likely going to pass it. I mean, it's already at $500 million already. And even if we see a massive drop-off, it's very unlikely that we're going to see it drop off so much that it doesn't make at least another $100 million. That's why I'm thinking 650 to, the 750, 800, 850 max range. That is where we're starting to see this movie go. Again, assuming there's a drop-off. If there isn't a drop-off, if the drop-off is 54% like they think it's going to be, and if the foreign market stays normal, then it's going to make $1 billion. Like, that's pretty much a fact and a foregone conclusion at this point. Slicer Neon says, 2 questions. Was the release of Captain Marvel globally simultaneous to avoid competing with Endgame? Also, why no Endgame trailer in Captain Marvel? I think it's because they're holding that Endgame trailer close to the chest. I think they're going to want to try and make sure it's released at the perfect time. I think that they're also waiting to see what happens in week 2. I think the reason why they front-loaded Captain Marvel's opening weekend so much in the foreign market is not so much to do with not competing with Endgame. I think it has more to do with the fact that they understood that they wanted this film to be successful. I mean, they want any film to be successful, but they wanted this one more than any other. Add on top of that the fact that there was a backlash and also criticism from the very beginnings of this movie being made, because obviously if you follow Nerdrotic.com, Nerdrotic is a really great channel. He's talked a lot about how the comic industry has suffered a lot because of essentially this SJW takeover of the industry, where you have not just Captain Marvel, but many other characters and many other writers bringing in characters and bringing in storylines that don't connect to the audience. Because even by Disney's admission, Disney released statistics saying that 60% of those who went to go see Captain Marvel were men. That to me kind of speaks for itself when you realize that these stories, therefore, even the ones that are starring the strong female Mary Sue, are still being seen in the vast majority by men. Comics industry, it's even more wide. The gap is even more wide, and yet Marvel Comics and a couple other groups decided that, no, what we're going to do is we're going to tell stories that are going to appeal to these very minute groups, these very small groups, because we want to reach out. We want to try and bring new audiences in and new people in. But the problem is that you're doing so by alienating the audience that has been supporting you from the very beginning. And this is what Star Wars has learned. You don't just bring in new characters to try and reach new audiences while at the same time destroying the old characters. It just doesn't work that way. If you try and do that, you're just asking for failure. You're setting yourself up for failure. Because basically, if you think of the original characters, and let's stay with Star Wars for a second, if you think of the original characters as being the foundation of Star Wars, if you knock out the foundations, no matter what you try and build, it's going to fall. It's going to crumble. There's nothing for it to stand on. The same thing with the comics, too. If you decide that, the male audience, that we're just going to say, screw you. We're just going to say, okay, it's not about you anymore. As Brie Larson says, this isn't made for you. Again, this isn't for you. This isn't being made for you anymore. Well, then guess what? You're going to screw over a large portion of people. You're going to screw over your core fan base. And I think that Marvel Comics is a great example, and I think that Marvel Comics is a microcosm of what we're about to see happen in the film industry if they go in this direction. So far, all we have is Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is really the only film so far that has really even tried to delve into this kind of territory. So it really depends on what Kevin Feige does going forward. Once we have Endgame, I think Endgame is fine. I think the Russos are going to make sure it's one of the best films they've ever made. I think they're going to keep Captain Marvel in check. They've already said in interviews that they don't like the idea, just like many fans don't like the idea of just one OP character with no flaws. So I think they're going to try and build the character as such. Yes, there could be studio interference. Yes, there could be a lot of things that happen. But I honestly believe and trust in the Russos to be able to do the right thing. And then, just like always, we'll have to wait and see. But I try and believe and hope for the best and expect potentially the worst.